Hello friends, it is Cynthia. I hope you are doing great. Welcome back. Today we are going to talk all about how to carve a beautiful kind of farmhousey looking sign for a hen house, chicken coop, or your living room. This is a really fun carve. It is based off of a cut file that you can actually get for free over at Home Beautifully, and let's dig into how to carve this sign. The first thing that you're gonna do is get all of your materials together. For this project, we used pine that I got at my local big box store. You're also gonna need something to carve it. For this project, I used my X-Carve, which is like a mini CNC from a company called Inventables. You'll need your carving bits. I'm using two different bits. I'm using a carbide tip 1/4 inch straight flute. Looks like this. The second bit that I'm using is for the detailed pass. This carves out the details. The bit that I'm using is called a V bit because it makes a point on the top. And this is a 60-degree V bit. You'll need your sander. I used my little Ryobi hand sander. You'll need sanding paper. You can see it doesn't fit, but it works. And then you'll want to get paint and stain. I actually used Oops paint that I got at the local big box store. This was $9 and a random shade of white. My favorite stain that I always use is Minwax Provincial. Also want either a rag or staining brush or staining sponge to apply the stain. You'll also want something to cut your board. So for this project, I used my compound sliding miter saw. This is also from Ryobi. So the first thing that I did is I cut my wood piece to size. I bought a 1x12 by 8. It was either 8 feet long or 10 feet long, and knew that I wanted this to be 15 inches long, and so I used my sliding miter saw to cut the panel to size. The second thing that I did is I actually painted it. And so I painted this top surface because I knew that I would want the part that was raised to be painted and the part that was recessed to be stained. So I actually painted this project before I began. I used latex paint. I actually wasn't really nervous about brush strokes, and so I didn't use a product like Floetrol to even out my brush strokes. In fact, I kind of wanted brush strokes because I knew I wanted it to have this really old, kind of worn and weathered. So I did 1 coat of paint. I kind of applied it thickly, not worrying about brush strokes, and I let it dry overnight. Now, in hindsight, I should have let it dry a couple more days because latex paint can get a little peely when you carve into it, and the edges get kind of frayed, sort of like when you tear plastic. And so the longer you let the latex paint cure, the smoother those edges are going to be when you carve them. So live and learn. One of the things I learned on this project, don't paint it one day and carve it the next day. The second thing that you'll want to do is to prep your carve. Now, I use an X-Carve, and I actually use a program called ALLLL that it's from Inventables and works really well with the X-Carve. So the first thing that I did was I entered in the dimensions of my sign, and then I went to File, Import SVG. I imported my SVG and I sized it to fit. Then, because I wanted this like frame around it, I actually use a technique called creating a pocket. And so I overlaid a rectangle, I sent it behind this image, and I set the depth of the rectangle so that it would leave effectively a frame around the piece. So in ALLLL, I then made sure that my board dimensions and my depth were correct, and I set my bits. So for my roughing pass, I used my carbide tip straight flute, and then for my detailed pass, I used my 60-degree V bit. Now for this project, I actually played with my feed settings. And if this isn't something you're comfortable doing, I encourage you to use the manual settings from Inventables to play it safe. If you are comfortable doing this, changing your feed settings is a good way of really fine-tuning your project and also speeding up the carve. So I used an app called CNC Millwright to figure out how to adjust my speed settings, and I'll include in a comment below what settings I used, or you can check out the full tutorial over on my website. I'll include a link to that below too. So I mounted my board on my, that's not the right word. I clamped it, clamped it down. I clamped my board down on my wasteboard of my X-Carve using clamps from Inventables. I set the height of my wood using what's called a Z probe, so you get the vertical depth exactly right. Now, I actually messed up a little bit here because on this project, when I probed it, I don't think I probed in the same spot for my rough carve and my detail pass. So one good thing for me, a takeaway from this project, is when I do set my Z axis to make sure I'm setting it in the same position, which if I'm carving in a pocket like this, will need to be on one of the edges. And then when you're ready, hit carve. So this carve took a little bit over an hour. I want to say it was 30 minutes for the detail, no, 30 minutes for the roughing pass and an hour and 20 minutes for the detail pass. And when the carve was done, I actually had a little bit more work to do. So I'm still learning. I'm not an expert at carving wood signs. And for this project, I had a few issues pop up along the way, which I'll talk about in a minute. I actually had to clean up some of the letters on this. And so I went in and I used my Dremel. Now, when you have your X-Carve kind of dialed in exactly the way you're supposed to use it, you are not gonna need to do this step, but I am still learning what I'm doing. So I had to pull out my Dremel and kind of even out some spots along the way. You know, whatever, you like make your project work, you know what I mean? And then to finish the sign, the first thing that I did was I used my little Ryobi sander and I took a lot of the paint away. So you can see on the edges, I really went in and distressed. Now when you're distressing, it's important to stick to the edges, not kind of distress randomly in the middle so that it looks like it's been worn down in a place that would age naturally. And then I hand sanded using just my hand and sandpaper, because that's not obvious, sort of some of the rough parts left over from the bit lines on the back. Then to finish it, I broke out my favorite stain, Minwax Provincial. I do not work for Minwax, but this is my favorite stain in the entire world. And I used a staining brush, my favorite staining brush, which is just a really cheapy old paintbrush, and my stain, and then I cleaned things off with a shop rag that my husband left around and is now a staining rag. The funny thing about my staining brush is when I went to wash it off, I could not find like the regular hand soap. And so I had to use his Axe body wash. So now my staining brush smells like a man, which I think is very funny. One of the big lessons I learned was finishing a sign in a farmhouse style finish covers a lot of mistakes, which is great because there's a lot of things about the sign that kind of moving forward I would do differently. You can see some of the letters are just not perfect, which I actually think adds to the charm of the sign, but if I wanted to do the sign in a different finish would be a big issue. So I reached out to my Facebook woodworking group and I said, like, what happened? So here's a few things that I'm gonna try for next time. First, I don't own a planer, and I think I might need to. This is just stock from a big box store. I think if I ran it through the planer, it would have helped fix some of the issues that I had where the V-bit kind of went a little too deeply in some places. I also had people recommend not to use stock pine from a box store, but instead to go to a specialty store like Rockler and get nicer wood and edge join them together to make my own project panels, which is a good idea. And actually poplar or basswood at more specialty stores, honestly not that much more expensive than pine at Home Depot. Other ideas that came up were to make sure that my belts, my V-wheels were tightened every single project. Someone said just because they were tight yesterday doesn't mean they're in good working order today, so that's a good lesson learned. Another recommendation that came up was to make sure the steps are calibrated well in my Z-axis. I don't actually know what that means, so I'm off to go like Google and YouTube a lot of videos, but I'm hopeful that that's a good tip for what works next time. If you want, you can grab the cut file for free at homebeautifully.com/shop. It uses the word shop, but it's free, so go grab it. What questions do you have for me? I'm learning, y'all. I am not an expert, but I'm certainly making a lot of mistakes along the way, and I'm hopeful that you don't have the same mistakes I have. I hope this project was fun for you. Pop a comment below any other projects that you want to see, and I look forward to creating more content.